Okay, so with that, I would like to introduce our speaker and introduce the theme of the event. So tonight, we are joined by Professor Michael Lind, who is currently a professor at the University of Texas at Austin and the Lyndon Baines Johnson School of Public Affairs. But he has also been a fixture of some of the most interesting writing in the political world for quite some time. So first off, Michael Lind helped found the New America Foundation back in 1999. He's written lots and lots of books on everything from American identity to class conflict and class relations, to the definition of nationalism, to economic cycles in American history, all the way to an epic poem about the Battle of the Alamo. He has written quite a lot of interesting things, including not a small amount of poetry and reviews. And in that sense, I always like to think that he's in some ways a living reminder of what American public intellectuals were like in a time where we had a better public discourse. So he has done all those kinds of things. But in terms of where he stands, let me just give you a list of some of the places Lind has written. He's written at the New York Times, a standard center-left publication. He's written at the National Review, the flagship publication of the conservative movement for many, many decades. He's written at American Affairs, which some people call the main organ of intellectual Trumpism. He's written at Dissent magazine, which was a kind of leftist review, and still publishes interesting stuff. And he's written at Politico, obviously, and various others. So some would say that Lind is ideologically heterogeneous, but I think it would probably be more accurate to say that he's ideologically very consistent in a very unique way that's unique to American politics, but can showcase some things that a lot of us on other parts of the ideological spectrum often forget. Most recently, he has written a book called The New Class War. It's a book on some of the class dynamics and economic dynamics of the present discontents in American politics. And that is what a lot of this conversation, I hope, is going to focus on. So with that, Mike, welcome to the America's Public Forum event, and thank you for joining us tonight.
Well, thank you for having me. Let me apologize for being so orange. I'm not endorsing Donald Trump. The light in my room was flickering, and rather than subject you to that, I turned it off, and I have this lamp that makes me look like the Great Pumpkin in Charlie Brown. So if you'll bear with me, that's the situation. I'm really honored to be part of this group because I teach public policy now at the University of Texas at Austin, in my hometown of Austin. And I like to ask students, what is the purpose of democracy? And some will say to achieve social justice, and others will say to achieve the popular will. And I offer my own definition, which you may agree or disagree with, which is to avert civil war. So you have ballots rather than bullets. And you have people who disagree about everything except the need to continue living together under the same government in the same country. So civil discourse, to my mind, is the very essence of democracy. It's not elections, it's not the rule of law. Those are elements of it, but it's constant conversation and disagreement. My friends at the Breakthrough Institute have sessions on what they call achieving disagreement. So merely being disagreeable is not disagreement. You have to actually understand your adversary's arguments in order to really achieve disagreement. You may still reject them, but at least you understand them. So thank you for having me.
Well, on that happy note, let's talk about some words that people disagree about in our contemporary political discourse a lot. So your recent book, The New Class War, talks about, obviously, class warfare. And then a lot of your work, especially in earlier this decade during the late Obama era and into the early Trump era, was focusing on definitions of nationalism and sometimes populism, but you were more well known, I think, for kind of resuscitating the term nationalism from an America that was kind of hostile to it in a lot of ways. So just tell us, when you say nationalism and when you say class conflict and class compromise, which are very obviously loaded terms in the contemporary political discourse, but use them to great effect. What exactly do you mean, and how does it apply to us in this last couple of years of the age of Trump and oncoming 2020 election?
Well, I think when people use nationalism, they basically misuse it. There are two things going on. Nationalism as such is a very empty, if not benign, open concept. It just means nation statism. It means that the unit of your government is the nation state rather than a world government or a city state or a medieval dynastic empire with a royal family. So in that sense, nationalism is kind of banal. Basically, most of the countries, 190 or so in the United Nations General Assembly, are nation states. There are a few which are bi or tri or multinational states, that is like Canada or Switzerland, where there are several constituent cultural nationalities, and their role is recognized in the Constitution through quotas and through special arrangements in the legislature. So in that political science sense, nationalism is completely banal. Where it becomes controversial is in economics on the one hand, and is in culture and identity in the other. And to start with economics, nationalism began being used as a dirty word in the sense of economic nationalism during the neoliberal period, which started, and it was a bipartisan consensus, sometimes called the Washington Consensus, from Thatcher and Reagan on the right, to Bill Clinton and Tony Blair on the left, Gerhard Schroeder in Germany. Essentially, after the Cold War, both the center left and the center right rejected what had been the earlier more statist and nation statist, because it was nation states that were doing the statist things, a system we had, like the New Deal in the US, the social democracy in Sweden, had different forms in different Western nation states, but they all had a strong role for the government in regulating finance and trade and immigration, and in having some kind of government brokered labor peace between capital and labor. And it was a bipartisan thing, from the center left to the center right. You had this new consensus that, well, no, that was a mistake. We need to deregulate things. We need to maximize the flow of goods and services and money, and also people across borders. And that was shared from Clinton Democrats to Reagan Republicans and Bush Republicans. It is defended still probably by the majority of the centrist establishments in both parties. And if you see a Biden election, you'll probably see an attempt to reestablish this consensus in some form. The Sanders left and the Trump populist right, which isn't all that right wing. I mean, in many ways, it's somewhat to the left of, the Bush Republicans, economically anyway. These were rebellions against this consensus. And they were both different aspects of the rebellion. The Sanders left rebelled against what Bill Clinton said in his first term, that the era of big government is over. Well, obviously, the Sanders and AOC and Warren progressives disagree with this. And the Trump right, which inherited what used to be the skepticism of the Democratic labor unions about large-scale immigration and trade, mainly because of their effect on workers. But that's now been inherited more by the right than by the left. And that criticized neoliberalism on trade and on immigration. And there are obviously cultural aspects we can talk about with immigration, but there's this economic argument. There's a reason why corporations spend hundreds of millions of dollars lobbying for more guest workers, more immigration, and so on. And unions historically have tended to oppose it. It's a reserve army of labor, that they can use to keep wages from rising, and in some cases to deter unionization. Now, one of the ironies of all of this is that the left and right have completely flipped on these topics in my lifetime. So in 2000, most of the people who wanted to restrict unskilled immigration and to crack down on employment of unauthorized immigrants were Democrats. In the year 2000, as recently as that, 20 years ago, Tom DeLay, Herbert Walker Bush, George W. Bush, representing the interests of employers, wanted to increase immigration, to turn a blind eye to enforcement of border laws, which they did, in the interest of agribusiness, of hotels, of these other low-wage employers. So, and the same thing is true in trade. So, if you go back to 2000, it was Democrats like Dick Gephardt, who were criticizing NAFTA. And NAFTA actually was a Republican trade treaty that Bill Clinton signed up with, and it passed with the support of a minority of Democrats and a majority of Republicans. So on trade and immigration, the two parties have flipped, and we can go into the reasons for this. But I have to say this, particularly with young people, because if you joined the conversation 5 minutes ago, right, you think that the Democrats were always for more immigration and free trade, and that less immigration and controls on trade and international capital flows are some kind of sinister right-wing fascist idea. Well, they were Democratic orthodoxy pretty much, just 20, 30 years ago. So partisanship and policy flip back and forth. And so I've spoken about economic nationalism as opposed to neoliberalism, globalism, which isn't really globalist, and we can get into this if you want to. So, sometimes populists say, oh, there's this globalist elite, and it has no loyalty to any country and so on. As I point out in the New Class War, there are people who claim that they're citizens of the world, but that's not actually the case. If you look at the business elites and the financial elites in the US and in Western Europe and in other countries, other regions, they are deeply, deeply rooted in their societies. And I have the statistics in the New Class War. Most multinational corporations are actually primarily national corporations. They have 40% to 50% of their sales within their domestic home markets, right? So Daimler-Benz is essentially a German company, which has about half of its sales in Germany and the other half in North America and Europe and Asia. Ford is an American company that has a lot of sales in China and Europe. And if you look at their boards of directors, their managers and so on, these are not global cosmopolitan capitalists, Jewish or otherwise, anti-Semitic, globalist theories. They are actually German, right? Daimler-Benz is run by Germans. Ford is run by Americans. So a lot of this debate between nationalism and globalism, I argue, is actually a debate among different groups within the nation state.
Well, that's those groups. And that's an interesting spot that takes us to the kind of class conflict question that I'd like to start to shift to in a few minutes here. But before we get there, so you just gave us a great overview of economic nationalism and kind of alternatives to economic nationalism that some classes and parties have proposed. Can you talk a little bit about the cultural dimension of nationalism and what that looks like? Because I think that is probably gets a little bit closer to the concerns that some on both left and right have with the term nationalism. And so, could you talk about that part as well?
Yeah. So nationalism basically originated after democracy, or at least after democratic republicanism, which kind of got its start on a large scale with the US Revolution in 1776, but only the French Revolution that introduced this to continental Europe, and then gradually via the French and European example, the rest of the world, including the post-colonial world. And so the basic idea is, in ancient times and in medieval times, democracy was associated with cities. You had city-states, like Athens and Rome when it was a city-state, and Florence and Amsterdam. So the question was, could you have a democratic republican government on a scale larger than a city-state? And that had never happened in the ancient or medieval worlds, because you could have a city-state that was democratic, more or less, not by modern terms. The vast majority of people were serfs or slaves, and you had a very small citizen majority, but it was still much more inclusive than a monarchy or an aristocracy. But so these democratic or republican city-states, when they conquered other territories, they ruled them just as despotically as a king would have done, sometimes more so. So you go from the Roman Republic to the Roman Empire, which eventually becomes a monarchy just to manage it. So once you have the French Revolution in the idea of large-scale democracy, you have to have a demos. Demos is the Greek word for people. So the question, who is the French people? What is the French nation if you're going to have a French national democracy? And that came in extremely restrictive, illiberal versions. To be French, you have to be not only French by birth, but you have to be a French Catholic Christian. Protestants and Jews cannot be truly French, right? Then there's a more inclusive definition that France is defined by language and culture, not by religion, and not by race. So there was always a strain of French republicanism that said you can be a Black Frenchman, you can be a Vietnamese Frenchman, and not simply in the superficial sense of having a passport, but of being a real member of the French community, of being as French as anyone, whose ancestors, fought with Charlemagne or whatever. And that was essentially, you've seen this in every modern nation state, because modern nation states, and let's just look at the West, but this applies to Asia as well, were carved out of larger multi-ethnic empires. So they, like the United States was part of this larger British Empire, it secedes. The Habsburg Empire and the Romanov and Russian empires in Europe break up, and their units are more homogeneous ethnically, but they still have different groups in their borders, whatever the borders are. After the Habsburg Empire vanishes, after the US secedes from the British Empire, they're minorities. And that's when you get this battle between the illiberal versions of nationalism and the more liberal versions of nationalism. So George Washington wrote a famous letter to the Jewish congregation of Newport, Rhode Island, where he said that, basically Jewish Americans are just as American as anyone else. We make no distinctions. In practice, that was sadly not the case from 1776 up until recently. All the way up until about World War I, the dominant elite of all parties in the United States basically was Anglo-American Protestant. Sometimes the basic view was that real Americans are either Anglo-American Protestants or they're culturally similar groups. So Germans and Swedes can join. Irish Catholics, can you be an American? Maybe, maybe not. Italian Catholics, Jews, great deal of discrimination, including all the way until after World War II. So there was a kind of, we talk a lot, one of the surprising things to me about the 1619 Project and all of this is how it has erased all of the distinctions within white people, which were very important up until fairly recently. I had a friend who worked at a New York Wall Street law firm in the 1970s. He was half Southern and half Irish Catholic. And he had to conceal this to get a job and work there. He had to pretend he was a Northeastern Protestant WASP. So this is within living memory, right? That there was a pecking order among white Americans. who collectively were above all non-white Americans. So, so the Civil Rights Revolution, what it does is it eliminates political and legal discrimination. Its effect is limited because it does not change the disparities that are left over from 400 years of prior, discrimination, both by whites against non-whites, but also the top dog whites against the lower class whites. And it also left unresolved the question, okay, well, if being American is not being an Anglo-Germanic Protestant, as it was in the 19th century, if it's not being a generic white Judeo-Christian, I mean, the whole Judeo-Christian idea was a kind of post-World War II thing where you try to, you try to bring in Catholics and Jews to what had previously been a very narrow kind of waspy Protestant definition of mainstream American. So the basic alternatives, and I wrote about this in my first book, The Next American Nation, 1995, you get melting pot nationalism, which is my own view, and I also think it's the one that will inevitably prevail. That is, you have this original British settler culture, which bequeaths us the English language and some customs and the common law and so on, but it's changed over time by different groups. And it's always been shaped by American Indian food, by African American, culture in different ways. Every wave of immigrants alters the melting pot somewhat, but with the exception of groups that have some kind of religious taboo against intermarriage, like the Amish. Most immigrant groups, after a couple of generations, lose their language and assimilate and marry out, and into the larger population kind of vanish. And this happened with the European immigrant groups, the non-British European immigrant groups. If you go back to 1920, there are very distinct German diasporas and Italian diasporas and so on. By the 1970s, most white Americans had both British and non-British ancestors. And that's one reason we talk about whites as though they're a homogeneous group today. They've been a homogeneous group for a generation or two. They were quite divided before then. So if you look at today's immigrants, Latinos assimilate at more or less the same rate in terms of what Stephen Trejo of the University of Texas calls cultural attrition, that is losing Spanish as the native language and marrying outside of the group. That happens about the same rate as with the Germans and the Poles and the Irish in the past. If you look at Americans, it's even higher.
Do you think there is a intrinsic conflict between this process of the melting pot and the natural pluralism of ethnic identities in both in urban areas and in different like dispersed areas of the country? Is there like an intrinsic, the melting pot is all going to be one thing, or is there room in it as well in what some people have called the salad bowl or sometimes the chili bowl, in terms of there being some real diversity despite the general melting pot as well?
Well, as a Texan, I prefer the chili bowl to the salad bowl metaphor, but look, at the end of the day, it does come down to endogamy or exogamy, that is to marriage. Because if you're 10% of the population or 5% or 20%, and you want your group to exist as a distinct group 100 years from now or 200 years from now, your kids and grandkids and great-grandkids cannot marry outside of the group. So if you look at the US Census, the biggest single ancestry group in the United States is Americans of German descent. Bigger than Americans of English descent, bigger than Americans of Irish descent. Those are the other big two, along with Mexican Americans. So German culture, which was it was huge a century ago. There were German newspaper. It was kind of like Spanish language media today, right? There was a St. Louis Hegelian school. I mean, they had German-speaking universities and professors, and partly because of persecution during World War I, but more through just assimilation. It vanished, and so the only people who are German speakers generation after generation today in the US are those who are belong to the Amish and other self-segregated religious groups where there's a taboo against joining the wider culture. So, and I think this is not just true in the United States, it's true. If you look at Western Europe, it has become a country of inward migration, as the US has been for centuries. And this is new in Western Europe, it's old with us, but they have a melting pot in Britain. I mean, you have English of Indian descent, and you have Scots of Indian descent. And they are not Indians in England and Indians in Scotland, they are English and Scots, right? I mean, they will tell you, I'm just as Scottish as anyone who came over with, or English as anyone who came over with, William the Bruce or William the Conqueror. So now this goes totally against the conventional wisdom of our establishment, which is that we have 5 races that are perpetual in the United States. And those 5 races are non-Hispanic white, Hispanic, or Latino. Those are government terms. And there's an asterisk, maybe of any race. Asian and Pacific Islander, which is a truly bizarre term, which includes everyone from Chinese Americans to Pakistani Americans, Native Americans, and African Americans. Now, as a social category, Black, or in the old days Negro, or now African American, has a real substance, just because of centuries of hostility, but also of courageous opposition, that these other sort of artificial categories do not. I mean, like the government says, I'm a non-Hispanic white. What does that mean? This is nonsense, right? I mean, my ancestry, I'm half Swedish, and the rest is Scots, Irish, English, and Jewish. Okay, so I have 4 or 5 different ethnicities. Those are not my culture. My culture is the common American culture that I share with my non-white in-laws. I have a huge extended family with people of several races, and they have the same culture as I do. So we use this term culture for race, and then we have these completely bogus definitions of race, right? That do not map onto lived reality, with the exception of what are sometimes called American descendants of slaves, who are a distinct either caste in the United States or arguably ethnic group, but are quite different, let's say, from Nigerian immigrants who work at the World Bank. And by the way, West African immigrants are more educated and make more money than the average non-Hispanic white American, mainly because of class. They simply, come from the professional class in Africa. So our whole language of talking about, of assuming that all Hispanics are underprivileged and oppressed, that all whites are privileged, and that even they are the same group, right? That Mexican Americans and Argentines of German descent are even the same group. I mean, this is nonsense. And the reason we have this nonsensical 5-race system, where only 2 of them, white and black, have some kind of ultimate social origin, was the Nixon and Ford administrations in the 1970s. They just came up with this for the census, and their orders, they had a committee, the committee's orders were, come up, they had some anthropologists and social scientists and so on, and they said, well, the census needs like fewer races than 10, but more than 2. So that's why I'm a non-Hispanic white, right? And that's why a friend of mine who is an Indian immigrant is an Asian and Pacific Islander. I mean, it was because of this totally arbitrary bureaucracy in the 1970s. And I'm fairly bipartisan in my criticism. I think progressives have betrayed their tradition of skepticism about power and skepticism about bureaucracy by reifying and treating these Nixon, Ford, OMB categories as though they were real social things. I mean, if the left is supposed to be questioning authority and questioning power, and yet they're having Asian and Pacific Islander Orientation Day on campus. They're simply mindless, obedient functionaries of the US Census Department. All right, so I'm trying not to be too polarizing, but I'm trying to underline my view that the US is actually not divided into 5 perpetually warring quote unquote races. This is a myth. Obviously, there's a lot of residual racism. Obviously, there's a lot of tension among groups, including different non-white ethnic groups. But we are not divided into these 5 permanent blocks, which do not blend, as the salad bowl model, right, suggests, because as I said, if you look at the rates of assimilation and intermarriage, you will have inevitably, unless everyone becomes kind of like the Amish and stops marrying outside their group, there will be a mixed race, multiracial majority of some kind.
Well, Mike, as a card-carrying member of that future mixed race, multiracial majority, half of whose ancestors are Asian and Pacific Islander Filipinos, the other half of whose ancestors are Hungarian non-Hispanic whites, I fully endorse this method of analysis, because sometimes I'm confused which one I am too.
So, your Hungarian ancestors in Hungary would be very baffled to be told they are non-Hispanic whites. This would be a very strange term.
Well, so this is fascinating, and I'm sure there will be a lot of questions on this once we get to the question session in about 20 minutes from now. But I want to ask you, so on this American identity question, there's another way a lot of people think of American identity, which is that it's based on principles. It's based on universal ideals in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. And I think actually there have been various people too who've argued that that's the real core of American identity, and it's intrinsically universalist rather than nationalist. Can you talk about that a little bit? And then I'd like to get to class warfare and class compromise after that.
Yeah, it's just a basic mistake, because the nation state is a compound. So democracy, liberty, civil rights, those are aspects of your state political culture. They're your political creed, which is a good thing, I think. I mean, I believe in liberal democratic republicanism. There are other political creeds like despotic authoritarian monarchism, okay? But it's a political creed of the state. It does not say who belongs or does not belong to the nation, okay? So if you are a Norwegian and, or this is some country, I don't know, that where you need a visa to visit the US as a tourist, okay? Whatever country it is, and you show up, at Kennedy Airport, and you don't have a passport, you don't have a visa, and you say, well, let me in, I'm an American. And the border security guard says, no, you're not, like you're from, I don't know, Transylvania. He said, but I believe in the principles of the Declaration of Independence, and therefore I'm an American. Because to be an American is to believe in the principles of the Declaration of Independence. I'm sorry, you're not going to get through customs in Kennedy Airport, right? And this misunderstands the historic hope of American Democrats and liberals, which was that the entire world would adopt American principles, okay? Right? That the Salvadorans and the Hungarians and the Chinese and the Japanese and the Indians and the Arabs would all adopt the principles of the American Revolution, liberty, democracy. It was not their view they would all become Americans, right? That is, this would simply now be the universal political philosophy. We would have somewhat pride of ownership because it kind of started with us and with the French and the Dutch and a few others. But it doesn't mean they actually become Americans. So the distinction between liberty-loving democratic Poles who believe in human rights and liberty-loving democratic Americans who believe in human rights is that it's a difference between Americans and Poles that is not a matter of their opinions, because they share the same opinions, right?
That's a really helpful distinction.
Huh?
That's a really helpful distinction, actually.
Yeah, because you essentially get rid of the idea of the nation state. If you define the nation in terms of the state, then you don't have a nation state, you have a state state, right? And the other is a sinister aspect to defining your nation in terms of a political creed, which everyone in your nation may not share. Okay, now remember, Joe McCarthy's committee was the House Committee on Un-American Activities. Okay, so in my view, you can be undemocratic if you're an American, whether by birth or adoption as an immigrant. You're an American for life. Nobody can take that away from you. I mean, it's part of your identity. And if you're an American, you do not have to believe in liberalism and democracy. If you're an American fascist or an American communist, you're still an American. I think you're a bad citizen, probably kind of a disagreeable neighbor. But, you know, if you're an American and you think that the wrong side won the American War of Independence, and we would be better off today, you know, as part of the British Commonwealth with Queen Elizabeth II, our head of state, you know, I disagree rather strongly, but you are just as American as I am, right? So I think you want to be very careful about confusing national identity with political identity. And if you look at France, for example, the other great Enlightenment Republican Western country, because they started it along with us in different, somewhat bloodier ways. You know, they've always assumed, well, you know, if you were a French Nazi, you were still French. You were just a Nazi. I mean, they didn't say, you know, you had to believe in Republican principles to be French. Obviously, there have always been anti-Republican French citizens, and it's particularly important for a group like this, right? Because the moment you start defining membership in the nation in terms of political ideology, then you can excommunicate people from the nation if they have views that you find disagreeable or even repulsive. So it's kind of a dangerous thing in my view.
Well, I was actually thinking as you were saying that, Mike, the notion of national identity is something that exists beneath and kind of independently of political culture and political ideology, actually has huge implications for questions of civility and civil society and depolarization itself. So I'm glad you brought that up. I'll be thinking about that for a while. I just want to get through two questions before we get to the open question time. And the first one is incredibly broad. Your new book obviously is called The New Class War. Can you give us take a couple minutes and talk about how all this on the topic of nationalism and the nature of national identity and nationalist economics that you've been discussing, how that relates to class issues? What are the classes in America? What's the new class war about? Does it fit neatly across partisan lines, or does it go across different kinds of partisan lines? Tell us about the class war.
Well, thank you. Yeah, it's kind of odd when you talk about the nation and nationalism in America, people think you must be Mussolini. And then when you talk about class, they think you must be Karl Marx. You know, all political philosophy, from Aristotle and Polybius through Machiavelli and the founding fathers, takes it for granted there are classes. The major classes in the past were peasants and landowners. In a modern industrial society, there was the Marxist version in the 19th century, where it was workers and capitalists. In my book, The New Class War, I follow the ex-Marxist James Burnham and others in arguing that became irrelevant with the rise of large bureaucracies, not only in the corporate sector, private sector, but also in government and the military and the nonprofit sector in the early 20th century. So my argument is that the ruling class, and we have a ruling class, I belong to it by virtue of education and career, is not the 1% of super rich or even the 0.001% of billionaires. It's essentially those of us who are college educated. We're about a third of the population, slightly more, in the case of so-called non-Hispanic whites, slightly less, in the case of Hispanics and African Americans. But it's true in Western Europe too, it's about a third. That's the deepest division. That's not to deny there are divisions among the college educated, just as there were divisions among elites in the past. But essentially, almost all people involved in politics, you know, going down to the receptionist and the intern in the Senate office, have a college diploma. And the credential of at least a BA and increasingly of an advanced degree, this is the letters of nobility. It's the titles of nobility for our modern aristocracy in Western industrial capitalist countries. Because the main source of power is not individual money. Okay, if it were, the heirs to the Walton fortune would run the country. They don't. They give big donations and so on. The essence of power in modern advanced capitalist societies is your position in a powerful bureaucracy, whether it's Goldman Sachs, the Pentagon, the Ford Foundation. It could be nonprofit, government, corporate, and nobody who wields power in these massive, powerful bureaucracies has a high school education at this point in history. So that's the big divide. Now, as I said, just as the elite is divided into quite different bitter factions, and I can go into some of that later if you want, the working class is and always has been divided. It's divided geographically between what I call the hub city working class. These are folks in the who live and work in the big cities and the so-called downtown business districts and inner suburbs. And what I call the heartland, not to idealize it, just because I think hinterland is kind of a contentious term, which are not rural people, but these are people almost overwhelmingly working class of all races who live in the outer suburbs and the exurbs. And they live there because it's cheap. They can't afford to live in downtown Austin or downtown San Francisco. And the workers in the hub cities tend to be recent immigrants who make up 20, 30% of the population in some cases. But they don't necessarily plan to be there forever, right? They too will move, excuse me, I'll drink some water, to the exurbs to get a house or to have their wages go further. So I argue it's not an argument that we're polarized between the elite, what I call the overclass, and the working class. But that's the basic structure. My argument actually is more pessimistic, which is that except for occasionally casting their votes every few years, the bottom 2/3 of the population has essentially no influence on government in the United States and in pretty much in Britain and France and Germany as well. That is, most of which we think of as the battle among left, right, and center is actually left, right, and center among college educated people, the top third of the population.
While Mike drinks his water, I just want to make a note too that the vast majority of the kinds of people who come to these debates, including myself, including Mike, as he mentioned earlier, including a lot of us, are by that definition members of this elite, college educated and all that kind of thing. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just that there are structural issues with that Mike in his work here has elucidated. So Mike,
yeah, I'm not making a populist case. I'm very critical of populism. So it's not that elites are bad and working class people are good. You have to have elites. You know, even if you got rid of all the elites tomorrow, then you'd have to create new elites, right? You know, so the problem is when the power and authority of the elites is not sufficiently constrained by representatives of the working class. And my brief argument in the New Class War, a brief book, is about 40,000 words, is that, there you go, is that in the middle of the 20th century, mainly because of the mobilization of the world wars, which had government in the US and other Western democracies impose labor peace by forcing employers to negotiate with unions for the purposes of defeating the Axis powers in World War II. That was the most important aspect in the growth of labor in the United States. And you find similar patterns in Europe. So in the 50s and 60s and 70s, as the aftermath of World War II. You had this government-enforced class truce between labor and capital. You also had groups that were accountable to working class, high school educated people, particularly churches, were in Europe as well as the US. Religious congregations were much more influential than they are today. Now, if you're a libertarian, that's a bad thing because they censored all the movies, right? You couldn't say dirty words on radio, but that reflected the values of the working class who were fairly socially conservative. And then the other group was the parties themselves in the middle of the 20th century were more democratic than they had been before or since. They were federations of working class people at the local level. And the higher up you got, the more high-toned they got. But they were real organizations. And all three of these institutions have withered away. In 1930, under Herbert Hoover, before FDR's pro-labor legislation, private sector labor unionization rates in the US were 7%. It's down to 6.2% in the private sector today. It's actually lower than it was before the pro-labor reforms of the New Deal. The churches have collapsed largely in their influence over culture. Now you may celebrate if you're a liberal or libertarian, but it was one of the institutions that had some kind of connection between elites and the working class. And then finally, the political parties are not even parties in the United States. I tried recently, when I was growing up in Travis County, Texas, the Travis County Democratic Party, it was a one-party state at that point, like most of the South. And you had liberals and conservatives fought within the Democratic Party. It was an organization, there were precinct captains and there were, there's a hierarchy and you could join as a club and there were bylaws and all of that. And then they had state conventions and the state convention sent people to the national. So I came back to Austin 2017 from Washington. And I thought, well, how do I join the Travis County Democratic Party? So I go to their website and they have a donate here button. And I could not find a list of officers or how to join or whatever. The only membership group they had was Travis County Hispanic Democrats, which is fine, but as the government constantly points out, I am a non-Hispanic white, right? So I can't even join the Travis County Hispanic Democrats. So essentially the parties are dead. They are labels, they are shells, they are brands which are captured by rival teams of billionaires and candidates and spin doctors. And we see this with Donald Trump. He was a Democrat for most of his life and donated mostly to Democrats. Then he tried to take over Ross Perot's Reform Party. In 2000, he and his friend Jesse Ventura fought a battle over the Reform Party with Pat Buchanan and David Duke, the Klansman, and they lost. And Buchanan and Duke kicked them out. And then he decided, well, I'll try to take over the Republican Party. So these things are kind of empty brands. And I think particularly for your group, they may be sympathetic to this, they may not. But my argument is, if you just say, I am a Democrat or I am a Republican, that is, unless you actually serve in some kind of functional office in the party, then you're a fan. It's a statement of team loyalty. It's like saying, I am a Dallas Cowboy, right? Or I am a Laker or something like that. You're supporting a team, but it's essentially, it is not politics, right?
Well, on that note, Mike, we've actually thought about this quite a bit, and ever since we were founded, Braver Angels' policy has not been to have its members join as Republicans or as Democrats or as liberals or conservatives, but instead as Reds or Blues, which is a probably much more in tune with the kind of cultural nature and much more fandom in some ways, but also values-based rather than institutional nature of how a lot of us consume and participate in politics nowadays. So we're with you there on that front. Everybody, I just want to let everybody know that we're going to be getting to the question and answer session here pretty shortly, probably within the next 7 minutes or so. So if you have questions you'd like to ask Mike about anything he's said here, about some of his work, about how this applies to questions of politics and polarization, and particularly the 2020 election, feel free to start putting your Zoom hands up, and I'll start getting a queue of questioners ready here. But meantime, before that, Mike, I just want to ask you one last thing. You mentioned that there are these different kinds of organizations in the past, the churches, the unions that have done this kind of thing. And I just want to read real quick one of the quips from your interview at the Texas Review, I guess 9 or 10 months back now, that I think is just very, very explanatory and helpful. And I want to know if you can comment on how what you're saying about class representation relates to the values that you're talking about in this quote, and the civic culture of a greater, maybe not necessarily harmony, but greater social peace that you're talking about in this quote. So here it is, quote, "What I think about is how to hold a city, a state, a country together. Everyone has to live with everybody else the day after the election, so you want to have consensus building institutions as much as possible. There are some issues you can't compromise on. One side will win and one side will lose and has to adapt. But politics is about building coalitions. It's not about self-expression. It's not about crushing and humiliating the other side." So how does all this this class representation stuff, how does that relate to that other political ethos, and what are some ways you see that moving forward as we get past the 2020 election and are working in politics in the next decade?
Well, I think you actually have to restructure decision-making to some degree to reduce the stakes. Now, what do I mean about this? By that, what I mean is, for example, when you have governments, when the government sets up systems like wage boards in some sectors, where you have representatives of labor and capital and consumers set wages for the fast food industry. For example, New York did this recently. What you're doing is you're taking some decisions away from the legislature, away from the governor, and giving them to bodies they're not independent of the government, but they're using delegated power, where they negotiate things, and the government can oversee them and approve or disapprove. But you have this constant process of negotiation in that area. And you can do this in the areas of culture and education, maybe, and so on. The problem with politicizing everything so that everything can be changed tomorrow by a law, right? And B, having a majoritarian political system like we have, or even not majoritarian in the case of the Electoral College, where if you get 51%, then you can use the power of the government to annihilate the interests of the other 49%. That is the main source of polarization. The stakes are so high, right? Now, the stakes are not as high as the partisans say. We're not going to have a fascist dictatorship if Trump is reelected. We're not going to have a communist dictatorship if Biden is elected. But the stakes are high. And they are highest in the executive branch and in the judiciary for obvious reasons, right? So if a 5-4 majority of the Supreme Court can have enormous influence over law, whatever the law is, then that means every single appointment of a judge to the Supreme Court, which really should be and used to be a very boring thing, as who cares, right? Then it becomes this life or death issue, right? Because they have so much power. Same with the president. If presidential candidates like the Democrats in 2020, if you look at the Democratic primary, it would have been the same if there'd been a contested Republican primary. All presidential candidates run now pretending they are elected dictators. right? They say, here are the 15 things I will do by executive order on the first day. Well, fortunately, our system doesn't work like that, as they discover if they're elected president. But it makes people think, oh my God, right? This one person, if I lose this one election, if this one candidate is defeated, my side loses forever, the other side wins forever. It's a life or death struggle, total defeat, total ruin. Now, the genius of legislative politics, and the reason why legislatures have to be the major branch in every democracy, is because they represent different groups within the legislature itself. And they're constantly negotiating back and forth, and they can cut deals. It's not all or nothing, right? So it's not that you're a single politician and here's my platform, take it or leave it. And once I'm elected, if I deviate from my platform, I have betrayed the voters. That creates polarization, right? What diffuses polarization is negotiations. Not just once, but constant negotiations. And some of the negotiations are within government, like in the legislature. Some of them are in bodies which have government backing, but are not themselves government, like collective bargaining between unions and employers or employer associations. So the more people you have negotiating on a constant basis and able to make compromises now and then revisit the compromises in 2 years, that gives you a less polarized system. If you lose in one committee or in one bargaining round, you have a chance to come back, right? But if you lose the Supreme Court decision or you lose the executive order, then you're stuck until you have another Supreme Court majority, maybe 10 or 20 years from now, or you have another president 4 years from now.
Well, Mike, I think this gets us to a great spot to talk about some other things. And I know I have many, many more questions for you, but I'm sure I will send those to you in email format as I have pestered you with for the last couple of years. So instead, let's open it up to the audience who's joining us now to ask some questions. So everybody, I see that we already have a list of questions going on. So I'll try to keep it as, I'll try to get as many people in as possible, hopefully all of them. But to help with that, I'd like to ask that you try to keep your question, number one, in the form of a question, and number two, try to keep it down to 30 seconds, maybe 1 minute max. And I will unfortunately have to interrupt you or mute you if it starts to go too long. So yes, but please feel free to ask questions on what Mike's been talking about and how it relates to everything, and we'll try to get as many people in as possible. So first, we're going to go to Humberto Lemus-Villers. Humberto, go ahead and unmute yourself and ask a question.
Thank you, Luke. Thank you, Professor Lin. Big fan of your work. I'm an aspiring U.S. diplomat going right now to an Ivy League school, and one thing I've been very discouraged to see is that there is the belief of critical race theory, as you probably have been very aware within universities, where they try to put class or race instead of class as measurement. How can we really build a nation, or rather maintain the United States to whatever extent that it has today, with such an ideology or a belief where there is irreconcilable warfare, and how can we go back from that edge, specifically, as we've seen rapidly during the summer with the protests and riots as well?
Well, as you may gather, I'm not a fan of critical race theory because it's not actually a theory. A theory can be falsified. A theory can be evaluated on the basis of evidence and proven or disproven. It is a ideology. It's basically a totalitarian ideology, totalitarian in the sense that it is a closed circle immune to refutation. And it's like Freudianism and Marxism in that sense. So if you question Marxism, then that just proves that you are bourgeois, right? Your questions don't need to be addressed. If you question Freudianism, it proves that you're a neurotic who has childhood potty training problems or something. And if you question anti-racist critical race theory, that just proves you're a racist. Or if you're a member of a minority group, a self-hating member of a minority group. So I think it's an ideology. There's no room for intolerant ideologies in any democratic republic. And I think it should be, as I say, you can't reason with closed systems of thought. You may have to coexist with them, but you certainly shouldn't turn over your universities and your government bureaucracies to ideological propaganda. Having said that, having been born into a segregated southern state, racism and its residues did not suddenly vanish miraculously in 1964 with the Civil Rights Act in 1965 with the Voting Rights Act. So the polls showed racist attitudes among white Americans going down, but they still exist. And there are hostilities among other groups. I think the main, where I think our current discourse needs to be combated is equating all disparities with current discrimination, right? So if there are disparities among groups in terms of home ownership, of education, of whatever, then according to critical race theory, this is because of systemic racism, which is this vague cloud, and it's doing all these different things. And I think analytically, you have to break it down. Okay, so if you look at African Americans, the disparities in home ownership are the result of redlining against them, in the periods when white homeowners got home loans, but African American homeowners did not. That's greatly exaggerated because, in fact, if you factor out white billionaires, there's not that much difference in wealth between working class whites and African Americans. There is some, but they're all working class. They don't have much money by definition, right? Okay, but so then, you've identified the historic reason for these disparities, and different individuals may have the same disparity for different reasons, okay? So let's say you have an African American family that's working class because their ancestors were denied opportunities, all right? Then you have a white American family that descends from a long line of Virginia slave owners, and then they lost their money in the Great Depression, and then they gained their money back, and then granddad gambled it all away in the 1960s, and so now they're poor. So the question is, well, do you treat them differently because of the different family histories? Or do you say they both need health insurance? So my answer is, the descendant of evil Southern slave owners, if you can't afford health insurance, they need health insurance because they're US citizens, right? The descendants of oppressed minorities who can't afford health insurance, they need health insurance too, right? And the left calls this class reductionism. Well, if it's class reductionism, more power to it, because the vast majority of the disparities that result from racial discrimination also have other causes, right? In the case of individuals. So why don't we look at specific things that people lack and repair those lacks by whatever policy they are? And again, you don't actually have to go into how they got in that situation, right? I mean, I hope we live in a civilized society where if you're a drug addict and you go to the emergency room, they don't turn you away because you're a wicked person, right? You treat everybody the same. So those are my answers to critical race theory. It's an intolerant, potentially totalitarian ideology that should be resisted and dismissed. Not anti-racism. Anti-racism, perfectly legitimate. That's part of the civil rights tradition. But I mean this idea that that the U.S. now is this overwhelmingly white supremacist country that is trying to prevent non-whites from succeeding. That's just propaganda.
Mike, we have another question from Ibrahim Anli, who's one of our call managers here. He's having microphone difficulties, so I'm just going to read it out for him. So what we see in one sense is a dissolution of the separation of powers, where the legislative branch, at least the Senate, appears to have abdicated its responsibility to be in tension with the executive branch. Do you think if the founding fathers could see the present state, would they be tempted to tweak any part of the Constitution to mitigate this imbalance in the separation of powers? Or is this current situation not unique? And have we seen similar things to the present executive legislative situation before?
Well, the founding fathers turned out to be wrong by the 1830s, when John C. Calhoun, the rather notorious defender of the slave South and the states' rights, but he was a truly brilliant political theorist, and he pointed out that we now had like 40 years of operation in the 1830s of the U.S. Constitution, and far from preventing monopolies of power in a single party, the entire purpose of the two-party system, which had evolved by the 1830s, it was then Jacksonian Democrats and Whigs. The purpose of each party was to gain control of all three branches and destroy the separation of powers. So we have not been in a separation of powers regime since, the Napoleonic Wars. We've been in a series of party regimes where you have a dominant party that tries its best to control and keep all three branches forever. I think what they might be astonished by is the degree to which the Congress, which they assumed was the most powerful branch, has just abdicated and delegated all of its authority, and has become kind of a powerless talking shop. I had some hopes that at the beginning of the COVID-19 crisis, they would exercise some leadership, but essentially what they did was they just delegated it all to the Federal Reserve. They just said, okay, we authorized the Federal Reserve, a group of unelected technocrats that nobody ever voted for, to do whatever you think is best, to save out the economy and just like write whatever check you want. And, don't even have to have reports, just kind of save the country. So I like to joke now, it's kind of a grim joke that we have three branches of government. The Supreme Court makes all laws regarding sex and reproduction without democratic input. The president is essentially a dictator in foreign affairs, right? So Obama launched three unauthorized, unconstitutional wars in Libya, in Syria, and in Yemen. It's like, okay, and Trump's, so far is not, he's actually the most dovish president of my lifetime. He's the only one since Reagan, I think, who's not launched a new war, maybe since Carter. So the president is the foreign policy branch, the Supreme Court is the sex branch, and the economic branch of the government is the Federal Reserve of New York, right? There's a term post-democracy, which some British political theorists use. And they argue that we've essentially moved to an executive and judicial and bureaucratic regime where the London Parliament and the US Congress, really have very little say. And it's long been this case in France and in a lot of the republics of Latin America, where they're kind of plebiscitary presidential regimes. So they're not dictatorships in the sense they're rounding people up and arresting journalists and so on, but they're kind of policy dictatorships, right? You vote for the president convenes a cabinet that nobody voted for, a bunch of appointees. And they're the people who really run the government, right? And then the French legislature or the Argentine legislature, they have debates and so on, but it's actually the cabinet members in the executive branch who are the real government.
Mike, this is an incredibly pessimistic take, but it is very revealing as well. So fully appreciated. Just to clarify to everybody, sorry, that question was not actually from Ibrahim, that was from Jack Downs. So Jack, thank you for that question on constitutionalism. We're going to go next to a question from Ben S. Ben, could you unmute yourself and ask a question in under 30 seconds?
Hey, thank you. So this is something that I've gotten from Yuval Harari. And he pointed out how nationalism has limitations with regards to issues of, say, climate change or massive technological innovation coming in the next century. Do you see that as well? That if people can't rally behind a common world or human identity, that there could be a limit to cooperate and solve these problems?
Thank you, Ben.
I disagree with the way that's framed. We live in a world of nation states, and that's going to stay the same for generations or centuries to come. We're not going to go back to city states. We're not going to have a world government. But the fact that you have a world of nation states doesn't mean the nation states cannot cooperate. And in fact, they have to, because the average nation state, I looked this up the other day, on the average population of the states in the General Assembly of the United Nations is about 30 million people, like the size of California, a little smaller. The US is one of the three most populous countries in the world. The other two are China and India. But most countries are fairly small. So the only way you can get anything done is by having collaboration. Now, there are two ways you can do this. You can collaborate on a case-by-case basis, right, through treaties and international regimes in a particular subject area. So for example, the reason we have airline travel worldwide is there's a single set of rules for pilots and airports. In all countries, communist and capitalist, Arab monarchies, libertarians, they all agree basically we're going to have the same international aviation rules. You could do the same for climate change. That's more difficult because there's disputes over the severity of it. I think most people agree it's real, but how severe it is disputed. Second, there are enormous costs, and there are winners and losers both in countries and within countries. Some classes win, other classes lose, depending on the mitigation or adaptation system you have. So in that case, it's very difficult. So the good news is, well, I guess the bad news is, it's very difficult getting 190 sovereign countries to collaborate on some global project. The good news is 4 or 5 or 6 countries have most of the population and economies of the world. It's the US, China, India. If you treat the EU as an entity, the EU, they basically, right now, these are 4 entities, they have about half of the world GDP and much of the world's population. So you actually don't need, and it'd be nice to get Sweden and Singapore signing on to some international treaty, but you really don't need them. If you got the US and India and China and the EU to agree to something, then that by default, you've done most of the work on climate change or on the economy or whatever. I'm being sincere. I have friends in many small countries. And they're not necessarily small people, they're big, tall people in small countries. So you want them to sign up on these accords too, but you really do not need to wait for Slovakia, the final holdout, on the international treaty. If you've got the big countries, you've got it done already. This was one of the things we saw in the TPP, by the way, which Trump canceled after both he and Hillary Clinton opposed it in the 2016 campaign, the Trans-Pacific. People say, oh, this has got all of these different countries in Asia. I don't remember how, like 24 countries. Yeah, but there were basically 2. It was the US and Japan. So originally it was the US and a lot of small countries in Southeast Asia. When Japan joined, it was basically the US and Japan. That is the vast majority of the economy of all of the countries put together. So it ended up being kind of 2 trade treaties. One was a US-Japan trade treaty, and the other was one between the US and the ASEAN countries of Southeast Asia. So that may seem like great power chauvinism, but that's the way the world works.
Thanks for that answer, Mike. That's my chat is blowing up with friends of mine telling me, wow, this is refreshingly honest. So let's go to a question from Janet real quick. Janet, would you like to unmute yourself and keep a question down to 30 seconds to 1 minute?
Excuse me, can you hear me okay?
You have a beeping noise.
Okay. Not good. I've had that. That help?
It doesn't.
Just
Janet,
go ahead, go ahead.
I'll type it. I'll type it.
Okay, great. Then we'll go to the next question, and then we'll Janet just message it to me, and then we'll take that question in a moment. Meantime, let's go to Andrew Figueiredo. Andrew?
Hi there. Thank you so much for coming on to this today. I greatly enjoyed the new class war, and I read almost all your articles, and Luke can attest to this. I wanted to know if you think there's a common left-right consensus around a set of communitarian views. You've discussed pretty extensively how there's two tracks of political ideology in America, that for the working class and that of the kind of the elites. So do you think that the new right and the left can really collaborate, or is the new right being disingenuous so long as they don't support labor, for instance?
Well, I think there actually has been this swing on both sides away from hyper-individualism towards more communitarianism. And you see this in like the Me Too movement, which in many ways is kind of conservative and communitarian. I mean, it's essentially repealing the aspects of the sexual revolution in the US and Europe of the 70s and 80s, which were, if you've seen the Austin Powers movies, I mean, it was the kind of swinging 60s sort of thing. And there's kind of a revulsion on both sides of the way this led to the treatment of women in particular. You know, and so now people can disagree about this. It's interesting a few years ago, I caught these old Roland and Martin Laugh-In episodes from the 70s and 60s, and they were, at the time, they were thought terribly left-wing and very libertarian and cutting edge. And you look at it now, it's these middle-aged men in tuxedos smoking, you know, cigarettes with daiquiris, making, you know, obscene jokes about women, you know. So I think there is kind of a convergence, you know, on that kind of thing. I think on labor, I contribute now and then to a bipartisan group. It's mostly Republican, called American Compass, organized by Orrin Cass. And they're Republicans who say, look, unions have a role, you know, in modern society. And this is fairly new. There are a lot of people in the Republican Party trying to destroy them and cut off their funding and ruin their reputations. I mean, they're threatening vested interests. But that actually was the view of Republicans. Richard Nixon got a majority of the union vote, of the private sector union vote. Eisenhower spoke at the AFL-CIO convention, you know, so there actually was kind of a bipartisan consensus on labor before Reagan and these neoliberal Democrats like Bill Clinton and Obama, who said good things about private sector labor, but it was very low on their list of priorities. So that's the question. You know, the way change happens in policy, and is very relevant to this group, is most people I know, even people who know better, think that the way change happens in American politics is your wing of the Republican Party or the Democratic Party takes over the whole party. And now that you control one of two parties, you then, in true Calhoun fashion, take over all three branches of government for 10 years. And you win every election. And you control the Supreme Court. And during this 10-year dictatorship of your one party that your wing of the party controls, you will then save America by passing like your, you know, list of 15 or 20 or 100 things, right? That has never been the case in American history. What you've seen is you've gone from a bipartisan consensus of one kind to a new bipartisan consensus. So if you look at the Civil War and Reconstruction, the Union was not just the Republican Party, it was Northern Unionist Democrats allied with the Republican Party. And Reconstruction had factions working together from both parties. The New Deal was a coalition of progressive and moderate Republicans with pro-labor Democrats, some not terribly progressive, pro-New Deal, you know, Southern Democrats. So So if I can leave you with one message, the idea that, well, the DSA lost this round, and Biden from the DLC got, the nomination. But in 2024, the Democratic Socialists of America will take over the Democratic Party. And then we'll take over the entire country. And then we'll, and the Republican version of this is the movement conservatives, who are kind of like Charlie Brown with kicking Lucy's football, right? Where, well, dang, we voted and they told us they'd do all this stuff. And then they went and did, like all this moderate Republican stuff. That they betrayed us once again, but next time we'll get someone like Donald Trump, right? And then, of course, he, pretty much the Trump administration, I shock my friends by saying this, but except for some of the tariffs and for his somewhat dovish foreign policy and his obnoxious persona, pretty much the policy is what you would have gotten under Ted Cruz, right? Or Jeb Bush. It's not a big difference. So if you want to do political change, you want to do two things. You want to spread a nonpartisan consensus that will replace the existing consensus that you think does not work. The other thing is, wherever you are located in our geographically polarized country, you should work within the dominant party. Let me repeat that. If you live in a mountain state that only elects Republicans, then running as a sacrificial lamb Democrat is not going to do anything. Okay, you should run in the Republican primary, in the all-Republican state. If you live in a state that only elects Democrats, then you should influence the party by running in the Democratic primary, right? And then when you have like-minded people in both parties on some issues, not all issues, there will still be issues that divide the parties, but there'll be others that they agree on. Then the blue state person and the red state person in Congress can cut a deal, right?
Mike, I think you have just given us, and thankfully it's recorded, so this will be something I will quote often in the future. One of the single greatest extrapolations of average American political psychology ever delivered. So, and I would contend that the historiography and hagiography of Arthur Schlesinger for Franklin Roosevelt and of William F. Buckley for Ronald Reagan and Barry Goldwater probably has contributed a little bit to that in the narrative, but hopefully we will not have a new version of it anytime soon. Meantime, we have another question from Janet, who was having some audio difficulties, so I'm going to read out her question for here. Thank you, Janet. Do you think our country's current divide over race is being exploited by our politicians to distract us from a class war between the upper 1/3 and lower 2/3 of our population, especially since it is an election year?
Well, yes and no. I don't think that they have this secret corporate boardroom where they plot this out consciously, but that is certainly the effect. But even in the absence of that, all parties, particularly those controlled by elites in democracies, are always going to appeal to working class voters on the base of non-class issues for the most part. And it can be religion, it can be race, it can be regional cultures, for an obvious reason. Working class people, if you define them as I do, as high school educated people, are 2/3 of the population. If there were a working class party, it would win every single election. You would have a one-party regime, right? So the fact that there are multiple parties, 2 major parties in the US and 4 or 5 in Germany or Sweden, or other European countries, that means that there are issues other than class, right? That divide the people of the same class and also unite people of different classes. So I think that's just a structure of politics, and I don't see the cure being through having like a working class party. I mean, there's a working families party in New York State, and there's there's some new party called Solidarity that's trying to be kind of, I read about, it's trying to be kind of a working class, independent third party. But my solution, which I touched on briefly here and talk about in the book, is that you actually move some decisions affecting the working class outside of day-to-day legislation in the Congress. So for example, instead of having a fight over raising the minimum wage as it's eroded away by inflation, where you have to have a majority in Congress pass a law, then you can delegate this either to a national body or a state body in some cases, where representatives of labor and capital and government just negotiate for, and it doesn't have to be for all sectors, it can be for a particular sector. There are several states in the US that have this very interesting institution called a wage board, which was created in the early 20th century for occupations, largely of immigrants and women, like piecework sewing, that could not be unionized effectively because they were too scattered. They weren't all in one factory, one workplace. So the wage boards had representatives of the workers in a particular sector and the employers in a particular sector and the government as a broker, sometimes consumers. And they were allowed to set sector-wide wages, sector-wide benefits, sector-wide working conditions. And Governor Andrew Cuomo, a couple of years ago in 2015, convened a wage board. This was a statute from the New Deal era. It had not been used in generations. And they decided to raise the minimum wage for fast food workers. And New York State has since followed up with a wage board for agricultural workers. So I think rather than having third parties, we're trying to have a working class party. You have these extra legislative institutions like wage boards. And collective bargaining, regular traditional collective bargaining, is an extra legislative institution. You're setting wages and benefits and working conditions by negotiation among employers and unions rather than by a congressional committee saying this. And there are problems with doing this solely by statute. So one of my first jobs, I worked for a very liberal Democratic state senator in the Texas state legislature in the 1970s. And he sent me to an occupational safety and health agency in Texas. And the official, who was a liberal Democrat, showed me this pile of volumes from OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. And it was the detailed federal laws for every aspect of workplace safety. And he opened it at random, and there were about 60 pages on the exact inches that ladders, the rungs on ladders could be, and exactly what kind of screws held the ladders. And he just threw up his hands, right? So there's a limit to which either the state legislature, or in this case, the federal government, can micromanage things for the working class. And to me, the alternative, which is not original, I mean, it was the solution for most democracies in the middle of the 20th century. Give the working class representatives a seat at the table to negotiate these things themselves. And you don't have to push everything through Congress or the Bundestag or the London Parliament.
So we have 6 other questions on the list now, and we are running down to about 15 minutes left. So I think I'm going to cap it at these last 6 questions. Everybody, I will try to get to you. Mike, if you can shorten your answers just a little bit.
Okay.
Thank you for the detail. It is wonderful and very helpful and informative, and I appreciate it a lot. So, and I'm sure everybody else here does too, especially the questioners themselves. So with that, let's get to these last 6 questions and wrap this up. So first one is from Roger Haynes. Roger?
Thank you so much, Braver Angels. Luke, you're doing a great job. Tell John Wood that. Professor Lind, fantastic. I wish I would have been able to read your book before this, but it's a really interesting idea about the working class. And I was trying to envision how, like, the founders who they were. You know, I'm not a super history buff. I'm learning through organizations like this, but how would we get representation from, say, the non-elites in government? I mean, you know what I mean? It makes a lot of sense. I lean red, you know, but I think it's a great idea. It shouldn't be that difficult, but I guess it is. So the framers were, I guess, educated. How do we get, you know, average Joes and Janes out there? Thanks, I appreciate it.
My premise is not necessarily that the representatives of the working class have to be working class, right? So that if you're representing high school educated people, doesn't mean you can't have gone to college. You know, doesn't mean you can't have come from a rich upper class family. But my premise is that we had a group of people, many of whom were actually middle class, who owed their jobs to working class people. So if you look at, in my mind, the two greatest civil rights leaders of the 20th century, A. Philip Randolph and Martin Luther King Jr., one was a trade union leader, the Porters Union, the Railroad Porters Union, and the other was the head of this coalition of African-American churches. So they had their congregation. King had to answer to his congregation. Randolph had to answer to his union members, right? And they would lose power if their mostly working class congregation, you know, did not give them power. So they were both actually quite educated middle class people, but they had a more direct dependence on support from working class people than your average politician does. That's what I mean. And the same with trade union leaders. You can have, you know, educated trade union leaders, but their jobs have to depend on their delivering the goods to their members.
All right, with that, let's go to Mary Grebenkemper. Mary, unmute yourself and ask a question.
Okay, if I can understand this right, given that we should not focus on institutional racism, but think about what the different groups need, whether it was healthcare or housing or whatever, where do you see police reform fitting into all this in terms of Blacks wanting to feel safe and protected and have justice? How does that fit in with not focusing on institutional racism? How do you?
What I'm arguing is that you don't use this term structural racism. You distinguish actual discrimination, which is real in some cases. So for example, there's a lot of evidence that police discriminate against African Americans on the basis of race and pulling people over and things like that. That's discrimination. So you have anti-discrimination policies. I'm not disputing that. On the other hand, when it comes to the fact that African Americans on average have inherited less property from their ancestors than white Americans, that's not, now it may be as a result of present day discrimination if they're being turned down for bank loans on home mortgages, in which case you attack that discrimination. But there's a lot of disparity that is not the result of present day discrimination. It may be the cumulative result of discrimination in the past, but it's just a disparity. And if you want an egalitarian society, let's just, while fighting present day discrimination, which we should do, let's just get rid of the disparities. We don't care where they came from. We just don't want these disparities among citizens in a decent society because we want a decent society. And we don't need to have like a 300-year history of how you got here. It's just, who cares? There's a disparity, we're gonna fix it. That's it, that's the end of the conversation. And in terms of police reform, there's a class element. As I say, there does seem to be some present day discrimination, but also if you look at African Americans in absolute numbers, the largest group of people who are killed in altercations with police are working class and low income white Americans because the white population is larger. The percentage is higher for African Americans, but basically if you're an upper middle class, professional, college educated white American, your chance of being shot by the cops is very, very low compared to if you make $15,000 a year right, and come from a broken home, you know, and grew up in a trailer park, right, you know, so there's a class element there too.
Thank you, Mike. Let's take a question from Kay Halpern now. Kay, please unmute yourself.
Yes, to continue this issue of talking about structural racism, actually, I'm going to kind of ask a question off of your answer to the previous question. You said, who cares about the causes of differences or, you know, between what Black people and white people experience, you know, let's just create a solution. And while that sounds nice, when I think of how I would feel if I were African American, that statement would be deeply hurtful. And it seems as if, I guess I would like you to respond to the idea of some kind of Truth and Reconciliation Commission in this country. And you also pointed out, you know, that—
Okay, 20 seconds.
That upper class whites are, you know, they're not apt to be shot. The likelihood of them being shot by police is very low. However, African Americans, regardless of their class, whether they're working class or well-educated upper class, are still much more likely to be harassed, discriminated, and even killed by police in their own neighborhoods than white people. So I would like you to respond to that. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate.
Well, on the last point, I would like to see the data on that. With police stops where they pull people over, it's a classless thing based on race sometimes. The vast majority, the overwhelming majority of people who are killed by police are of white, African American, Hispanic, Asian American, are engaged in violent altercations with the police, where they either have a weapon or seem to have a weapon. There are very few cases of unarmed individuals being assassinated by police. So this is largely about police engaged in violent confrontations in a country full of weapons, where they're dealing with people who either are criminals or suspected criminals, usually from a lower socioeconomic background. That is the vast majority of police shooting fatalities. When it comes to how African Americans feel, I don't know. I've looked at the polling data. If you look at the polling data, it shows that self-described white liberals are far more likely to think that the US is systematically unfair against African Americans than working class African Americans do, or working class Hispanics for that matter. So I would defer to their judgment, you know, that is, in terms of the truth and reconciliation, yeah, I think that's what American history should be. But I'm a historian, among other things. History is not a morality play, right? It's not a matter of condemning people, you know, for the last 100,000 years, and it's not a matter of idealizing them. So if you have, you know, this kind of sanitized version of American history, where you edit out all of the nasty stuff, then that's just propaganda. But if you then invert that and make it a morality play in which whites were all guilty and the founding fathers were these evil monsters, you know, and had no redeeming, you know, value. So, you know, I think the Truth and Reconciliation Committee is the historical profession. It's historical education. You show the good and the bad side. And you show in the case of racism, as I said, the US was a white supremacist apartheid state from 1789 up until 1964, 65. I'm not making any bones about that. But what I do object to, and you know, you may disagree, is I think from my own kind of social democratic background, ultimately I'm a New Deal liberal. Moral reformation of individuals is not a politics. Politics is about fixing particular problems, like lack of health care, lack of insurance, lack of access to a mortgage. And if I believed that to have a good society, we would have to have morally good people, I would give up. So I don't think you have political progress by having one moral reformation for an individual at the time. You do it by having groups of people who otherwise, they may dislike each other, but they collaborate on a case-by-case basis on particular reforms and make progress one issue at a time.
Thank you, Mike. Just on that note, Braver Angels spent the whole month of July and part of August doing a bunch of forums like this, but also podcasts and some debates on questions along this line. And we had a variety of voices and very passionate opinions from within the Black community talking about this very issues. So if you would like to see some of those, there's a lot of podcast content and video content on our Braver Angels website. We'll share that around later on. But I agree with Mike. This is something that is something that groups like this can do really well, and we have to engage it deeply. So with that, we're going to go to the last three questions, and let's try to get it in the next 4 minutes here. So first off, Avery James. Avery, unmute yourself.
Hi there, Luke. Hi there, Mike Lind. Thanks for being here. It's been a great conversation. I wanted to ask specifically from, I think, various angles of politics, we all come at this idea of what you've described as a sort of new nationalism. What would work and what wouldn't in terms of forming this coalition? One thing I find from the culturally conservative perspective about nationalism in the United States, a little tricky, are two things. The first is that in the history of the 20th century, it's been broadly speaking dominated by like a progressive tradition, right? You can really see this in the arc of Woodrow Wilson, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and then Lyndon B. Johnson as kind of these major figures of a sort of progressive nationalism that existed in the United States during that time period. And I think that's tricky, obviously, for coalitional reasons. But more specifically, I think, is the introduction of war to it, right? That the United States, by being such a large multi-ethnic republic, which I think, as you correctly point out, people forget it's kind of always been with the exemption of really early New England.
Avery, 20 seconds.
Yes, I will finish this up by saying I think war was a massive part of what made New Deal tripartisan work, and unfortunately what undid it, right? You start with, I think, the mass assimilation of European ethnics with the really coercive moves after World War I, followed by World War II and the Great Depression, flattening wages and a wartime economy, and finally the Vietnam War breaking apart the New Deal coalition, a tragic unraveling of liberalism. I'm curious for your thoughts on that.
Thank you. Avery?
Yeah, just briefly, I think that war has played a major part in bringing new groups into the mainstream and social reform, whether it was the abolition of slavery in the Civil War, followed by Reconstruction, the mobilization of labor by the Wilson administration and the Roosevelt administration. I think this is a horrifying thing. I hope that we can find a way to integrate groups into a common life in America without civil wars and world wars. So with that, you have another question?
Yeah, there's just two last questions, and then we'll close up and get to announcements. But Alex Mollahan. Alex, please unmute yourself. Keep it to under 30 seconds, please.
Hello. Under 30 seconds, jeez. So the short version is I got a buddy of mine who I argue with, where I regularly argue a case which is drawn quite heavily from your work. He is going to be an influential figure. He's going to be a diplomat one day. And he often will ask two questions which I don't have answers to. And I'm very interested in hearing what you think of these. The first is about the need to rebuild an industrial base in the United States. And what he often points out is that there is actually a lot of manufacturing in the U.S. A lot of it's been brought back, but it's mostly high-end manufacturing, which requires at least a semi-skilled workforce. The kind of, like steel manufacturing never coming back to America, and it's probably a good thing that it's not going to come back unless it comes back in a different way, because Pittsburgh's life expectancy went up after the steel mills all left, right? So it has to be less brutal than that. That's
20 seconds, Alex.
Okay, that's the easy one. The second one, a little harder, right? When I talked about cultural Westphalianism, he asked, what would that look like? And frankly, that's a very difficult question. I don't really know how such a thing could even be conceptualized in a sociological sense. You got to remember that Peace of Westphalia came after Germany spent a century choking on its own blood of wars of religion. I mean, how is America supposed to reach, is it feasible to reach such a settlement without replicating such a horrific experience? Or, how are we to come up with what will essentially be a critical piece of Western political thought if we're to, survive into the next century?
Thank you very much, Alex. Mike?
Yeah, well, so in terms of cultural Westphalianism, if you mean religious coexistence, we kind of had that after World War II. There was Will Herberg wrote a book called Protestant Catholic Jew, where there was this recognition that Jews, Catholics, and Protestants are all Americans, and this is part of the tapestry of American life. And I would add Muslims and atheists and neo-pagans, so I think we've had a fair amount of success. There are moral issues like abortion, homosexuality, and so on, but those actually tend to divide members of the same religion in their different wings. So they're not necessarily divisions between religion. In terms of industry, that's a different topic, but I think all major countries are going to insist on having some strategic industrial sectors for national security reasons, if nothing else.
And let's give the last question to Casey Cho. Casey, go ahead and unmute yourself. Please keep it down to 30 seconds if you can.
Hello, thank you for hosting this and presenting. So my question is, do you think promoting, I guess, sort of local or regional kinds of pride or like identity, I guess, could like help strengthen national unity by sort of like making, like, say, your pride as a New Yorker or as a Texan be more important than, like, say, your identity as like a specific race or ethnicity or religious group? Because and I think some of your writings, like a lot of your writings reflect like your sort of Texan roots. And
Casey, 20 seconds.
So I sort of just wanted to ask about that. Plus, a lot of the New WPA literature, I think, sort of has that regionalist focus from what I've seen.
Well, that was a great question, and the New Deal was not so much nationalist in culture as regionalist. They tried to play up the unique traditions of regions that had been neglected during the long period of domination by the Northeast after the Civil War up to Hoover. So they played up the South, the Midwest, the Mountain West, the California and the West Coast, and so on. And it made a certain amount of sense because at that time, the European immigrant ethnicities were fading. Whereas we have learned that among working class people, regional cultures are much more pronounced than among the college educated, simply because the college educated are more mobile. So wherever you go in the country, working class people are likely to have the local accent more than those of us who are kind of this part of this generic mobile national elite. So at the moment, because we're in a wave of recent migration, first from Latin America, but now predominantly from Asia, then I think these diaspora cultures, are obviously much more relevant to people's identities. But people, immigrants assimilate historically not to a generic American culture, but to regional cultures. And I remember when I lived in New York, I was delighted when a Somali immigrant cab driver pronounced 33rd Street, Toity Street, which was an accent going all the way back to the Dutch, in Manhattan. So these regional cultures persist, and they may be stronger in the long run.
Well, with that, we are several minutes over time, which is exactly the proof that we've had an interesting conversation here. So Mike, on behalf of Braver Angels and on behalf of everybody on my team, and I guess on behalf of everybody here too, thank you for this presentation and for these answers. I look forward to hopefully having you back in some form or another for future things, because you have always insightful analysis. So,
well, thank you, and keep up the good work. This is a vital organization. doing an important task.
Looking forward to being in touch on this. Now, meantime, with everybody else, thank you all for joining us this evening. Thank you for the wonderful raft of questions. What you just saw tonight is an example of how it's possible for people, as you saw in the questions and as you saw in some of Mike's analysis, with very different and sometimes even polar opposite views, can still be able to talk about these kinds of things in a way that respects the humanity of the other and respects as well the just common hearth that we inhabit, this great America, this United States of America. And what we do at Braver Angels and what our colleagues at the National Institute for Civil Discourse do in different ways is do our best to make those practices and make that work more available to more Americans, importantly in this age of polarization and social media divisions and crazy elections and all of that. So if you are interested in being involved in this work and finding other ways you can come to new events like this and just generally being a part of this great and expanding community doing this kind of work, there are 2 links in the chat, one for the National Institute for Civil Discourse and one for Braver Angels. Feel free to click on those links. We'll keep the Zoom call open for another minute or so just so that you can click those if you're interested in finding more. And we are a volunteer organization. I'm a volunteer. Ibrahim's a volunteer. Dennis is a volunteer. We come at this because it's our passion. It's our way of expressing our patriotism in these divisive and scary times, and our way that we're hoping to make a small dent in the American story so far as we can. And we invite you to do that on behalf of the entire Braver Angels community, on behalf of all of our friends at the National Institute for Civil Discourse and various other organizations. I would like to invite you to join us if you are so willing. So with that, thank you for joining us tonight. Please, if you're interested in following this, I've told you some of the ways. We've also sent some links to Michael Lynn's books where he talks about this stuff in depth. But with that, have a wonderful night, and we look forward to working with you in the future to continue this great work of building a house united. Thank you, everybody. God bless you, and God bless America.